The kindest thing you can truthfully say about George Lucas's 2002 interquel Attack of the Clones is that it is ambitious. It is ambitious in the sense that George really swung for the fences this time. It just happens that in so doing he threw his back out, and then the bat slipped out of his hand, incapacitating half his teammates. And the whole incident is remembered as one of the greatest disasters in sports history. But what if I told you that Attack of the Clones has the same structural pacing as, and I'm not making this up, Apocalypse Now? I say this not to convince you that Attack of the Clones is good, of course, it simply isn't. It is choked by a miasma of sleepiness and inattention to character or story. I say this to convince you instead that George approached this movie with intent. He just failed to stick the landing. So let's try and figure out what he was trying to achieve with that near-fatal swing of the bat. And in the process, I'll explain how this movie could have been tweaked to make it much, much better. This is Equipment for Living, with Star Wars Episode 2, Attack of the Clones. Alright, get your bearings. Once again, we're going to have to do some sleuthing to figure out whose movie this is. There are three central characters here: Anakin, Obi-Wan, and Padme. All the scenes that develop Padme's character were cut before release, which is to say that not only is Padme not the protagonist this time around, she's barely more than an ornament. That leaves Anakin and Obi-Wan. Anakin arguably undergoes the greatest change from learning the theme, but Obi-Wan carries two of the film's most important beats. I don't know if this is an attempt at ensemble storytelling, but it does go a long way to explaining why this movie feels so incredibly unfocused. The other thing to note is that the DVD runtime is 130 minutes, and that's the one I'm going with. The Blu-ray is 6 minutes longer, and it's full of tiny alterations designed to drive people like me up the wall. So, let's begin. Something important Senate vote. Padme travels to Coruscant and immediately gets her decoy blown up. Corday dies, and Jay Lagaya immediately feeds Padme the theme.
You did your duty. Corday did hers.
This film will, in its rare moments of lucidity, deal with the idea of duty. What is the value of subordinating your desires for a greater purpose? What are the things we must do regardless of how we feel about them? And crucially, when should you disobey your duty? The Phantom Menace suggests to the space bums that some bodyguards be assigned to Padme, which leads to the introduction of our dual protagonists. I remember being in the cinema at the age of 12, very excited to see this movie. The explosion at the start was unexpected and intriguing. The scene with the Chancellor seemed like the kind of thing adults liked having in their movies, but this scene just kicked me right out of the experience. Everything about it felt fake and phony, from the visuals to the intended emotions. And it goes nowhere near far enough to addressing the enormous 10-year interval between the previous film and this one. Adjusting to late teen Anakin after Phantom Menace still gives me whiplash. And it turns out this scene was a reshoot. Imagine how much worse this film must have been in the first cut. Anyway, these space bums obtrude into Padme's consciousness at minute 8, and this is the call to adventure. Specifically, the moment where Anakin goes rogue and promises that they're going to investigate the attempted assassination. This is the moment that will upend Obi-Wan's life, for example, and force him to learn how to impose obedience on his wayward protege. Not content with causing millions in property damage and claiming multiple lives without any whiff of legal ramifications, mercenary Jango Fett takes another crack at killing Padme, this time with a pair of venomous insectoids, which we are informed were the hardest things to animate in the entire movie. Do you even remember these things? Now, earlier, Obi-Wan completely shot down the idea of investigating the assassination attempt, but he also cautioned Anakin against politicians. And yet, when the assassination attempt is made on this politician, who is it that jumps out the window? Obi-Wan. And you know what else goes out the window with him? That's right, any semblance of character coherency to which this movie might hitherto have pretended. After a visually exciting set piece, the assassin hides in a gambling parlor. Obi-Wan cuts off the assassin's arm to remind you of a movie you actually like, and then the space bums decide to drag the assassin Zam Wesell outside so that she can conveniently be killed by her boss Jango Fett before revealing his name. Incidentally, can we talk about the fact that Zam Wesell is a changeling, which is to say a species of alien that can change its shape to match that of another species? What? Why is this even here? Why introduce a new idea that is completely at odds with everything that came before? Knowing that there are changelings loose in the galaxy completely recontextualizes everything you've seen before, and not in a good way. Were our original heroes really who they seemed to be? Was Mon Mothma really a human? Was Admiral Akbar really a Mon Calamari? What if Han Solo had died between episodes 4 and 5, only to be replaced with a changeling unbeknownst to us? Would Chewie be able to smell the difference? What level of regret would the changeling feel upon finding itself hounded by the Empire and then frozen in carbonite for its troubles? And what are the limitations of being a changeling? Can you do it permanently? Can you become any other humanoid species? I just do not understand the intention behind introducing such a complex and potentially world-unraveling idea like a species of changelings here at this point. And it never comes up again. When Sidious commissions an army of clones to do his bidding, who does he choose as his donor? Some bloke. Ostensibly, he was chosen because he was a good warrior, which, fair enough, but I have a counter-suggestion. Clone the changeling. Imagine an army of clones that all look different, and that could even look like their intended victims. Your enemies wouldn't be able to tell if they were fighting the right people or not. You could infiltrate every level of government with flawless doppelgangers, and there wouldn't be the need for any of this malarkey. Anyway, those are the thoughts that cross my mind during the seconds-long glimpse we get of Zam Wesell's incredible ability. And to be honest with you, I was actually distracted for the rest of the movie by the whole changeling of it all. But speaking of which, let's get back to that movie. So now that these space bums are all convinced that someone really is trying to kill Padme, they send her back to Naboo. She's kind of cross about this because she flew all this way and her motivation is to cast a vote in the Senate, which apparently doesn't accept postal votes or whatever. But once again, the Phantom Menace pulls strings to get Anakin assigned as her bodyguard. These two set off for Naboo, and Obi-Wan gets to work chasing leads on the mysterious but far less interesting assassin who got away. And I'm sorry, I'm getting sidetracked again. What happened to Zam Wesell's body after Fett killed her? Did the Jedi just keep it for science? Did the police come and take it away? I mean, this is like the equivalent of Bigfoot walking into a Manhattan bar and giving someone a wet willy and then just walking away. Why is no one talking about this? I mean, I'm so distracted by this. I had to check Wikipedia, where I learned that the changeling powers were hastily retconned by various superior storytellers to control the damage caused by George. The changelings can't do it for long, it requires immense concentration, blah blah blah, makes sense, but a larger question emerged. Why, and I cannot stress this question heavily enough, is the top suggested search item this particular word? Where was I? Oh yes, Anakin and Obi-Wan split up, and this is the break into Act 2. Act 1 ends at minute 30, barely 23.1% into the movie's runtime. The average first act of a film runs about 26%, so this is weirdly short. Scanning through my database, the next shortest first act I could find was Apocalypse Now at 23.8%, which is interesting, and I'll come back to that later. For now, our dual protagonists will be separated for all of Act 2 of Attack of the Clones. In the honeymoon, Obi-Wan starts off by talking unconvincingly to this CGI monstrosity who sends him to Kamino. Anakin travels with Padme, and in minute 34 she reveals herself as the B character by asking what it's like having to subordinate one's feelings to one's duty for the Jedi. They go to Naboo, where Anakin butts heads with her, and they embark on an entirely unconvincing romance amidst a gorgeous Italian backdrop. Fun fact, George personally designed Natalie Portman's costume for this scene. Is there anything this genius can't do? Credit where it's due though, I actually quite like Hayden Christensen's choices in this role. He seems really to embody the anguish George wants us to believe Anakin is going through. It's a shame his performance is so undirected. Meanwhile, poor Obi-Wan just gets soaked on the water planet, and poor Ewan McGregor has to navigate worlds of emptiness. Just like in The Phantom Menace, the honeymoon contains the most needlessly convoluted ideas in Attack of the Clones. Obi-Wan learns that some bloke called Cypher Dyas delivered the purchase order for the clones 10 years ago on behalf of the Space Bum Council. But Cypher Dyas has been dead for almost 10 years, and we have no idea who Cypher Dyas is or was, or whether someone else approached the Kaminoans fraudulently under his name, or whether Cypher Dyas is someone Obi-Wan knew personally. Or hell, whether for all I know, he was a goddamn changeling pretending to be a Jedi. And furthermore, we don't know if the Jedi actually ordered a clone army or not. Why? Because there was a massive time skip of 10 years between movies. And we've only met like 3 space bums, none of whom were named, or claimed to be named, Cypher Dyas. Obi-Wan's muted reaction doesn't give us much information to piece together the puzzle, and his walking cotton tip is no help either. Regardless, Obi-Wan's investigation culminates in him meeting the guy who shot the changeling a reel earlier. Obi-Wan seems immediately to apprehend that this is the guy, Jango Fett, but he doesn't do anything about it. He doesn't, arrest him or anything. Instead, he goes after him in the open as he's leaving the planet. This leads to another fun set piece, but it doesn't make a lot of sense. The scene ends with Obi-Wan putting a tracker on Jango Fett's ship. Meanwhile, Anakin's been dreaming of his mother suffering, so he decides to go to Tatooine to check it out. Is this what the movie is about? Is it about the assassination attempts? Is it about the mystery of who Cypher Dyas is? Is it about the changelings taking over the world? Is it about Anakin's relationship with Padme or with his mother? The movie sure as hell doesn't tell us. Anyway, George suddenly recalls the title of this series and gives us a space battle. Again, it's a fun set piece, and it's cute that Boba Fett learns from Obi-Wan's trick here and uses that lesson to catch the Falcon in Empire. This set piece happens bang in the middle of the movie and so constitutes the midpoint. Well, let's be generous and say that one facet of duty is obedience. What are Jango's clones if not mindlessly obedient? So fighting Jango himself here at the midpoint has at least some thematic relevance, but we have to be quite generous to make it work. And then things get worse. Obi-Wan tracks his quarry to the mounds of a sapient hive species, which again touches on the theme of obedience. He overhears some dull dialogue about a war and at some point is captured. Anakin's story in this stretch is far more interesting. He discovers that his mother married a moisture farmer and that he now has a stepbrother. But Shmi was abducted by Sand People days earlier. Anakin goes on a genuinely disturbing journey to track them down as John Williams' music soars. He finds Shmi, but she dies in his arms, and once again the music elevates the scene to the point where it almost works. The character who should be the protagonist of the movie slaughters a tribe of sapient humanoids in revenge. This kind of scene is actually quite effective and speaks to the ambitions George had for this prequel trilogy. It's all fairly sanitized and George cuts away quickly, but it's still such an interesting development for a sympathetic character to take. Anakin confesses the bloodbath to Padme, and for some reason it doesn't send her screaming for the hills. Cut back to Obi-Wan, who is being held captive, and at minute 87, or 66.9% in, he is tempted to the dark side by Count Dooku. Do you remember this guy, the second most interesting character in the prequel trilogy after Darth Maul? Apparently Count Dooku was Qui-Gon Jinn's master. If that's the case, then this whole thing is handled poorly. Obi-Wan and Dooku should be much more familiar with each other. Qui-Gon's name should come up sooner. And why is this guy who left the Jedi Order not known to us before this moment? Are Jedi allowed to leave the Order? If so, why doesn't Anakin just leave and look after his mum? I genuinely don't understand his motivation to want to be a Jedi right now. And coming back to Dooku, why not introduce him in Phantom Menace if he's going to be so important here? Why not have his departure from the Order be a subplot in that movie? Or better yet, you know what? Cut Dooku altogether. Bring back Qui-Gon for this function. Qui-Gon was already set against the Jedi in many ways in the previous film. Why not, after his close call with Maul, complete the process? Having Qui-Gon working for the Separatists would massively rearrange the landscape of this movie. For one thing, you'd start questioning whether the Separatists are maybe onto something. For another thing, Obi-Wan might actually be tempted to turn against the other space bums. For another thing, you could have Obi-Wan wrestling with whether the Qui-Gon he sees before him somehow survived Darth Maul's impalement, or if he's just a changeling. Anyway, the kids eventually get Obi-Wan's message about the main plot and disobey orders to blast off and help him on Geonosis. The rest of what should be a quiet soul-searching moment is filled with this unconvincing and mind-numbing factory set piece. As originally shot, this factory nonsense wouldn't have been in the movie at all, and instead we would have seen the kangaroo court trial of Padme presided over by Dooku, foregrounding both of them as much more important characters than they are in the finished film. But that, along with the interesting scenes about Padme's motivations and background, are left on the digital equivalent of the cutting room floor. Which, if you're wondering why the romance feels so forced, this is why. You have to care about both characters for a romance to work, and there's not enough of Padme in this movie to care about. Eventually, at 100 minutes, or 76.9% in, Padme and Anakin both disobey their respective duties and confess their mutual love for each other. This constitutes the break into Act 3. Padme is here because she's the B character, and the dual themes of obedience and duty are raised. And now that we've got that out of the way, George hits us with another distended third act. It is visually impressive as all hell, but I also remember being 12 years old and not knowing why any of this was happening. Wasn't this movie about assassination attempts, or like Cypher Diaz or something? There are a bunch of set pieces in a row, all expertly realized, and at minute 118, 90.8% in, Padme gets punted out of an aircraft and tumbles to the sand below. Anakin is beside himself at the prospect of losing another female attachment figure in his life, and wants to abandon his duty and go back and rescue her. Obi-Wan talks him out of it, and the two halves of the theme briefly come together. There are times when it's appropriate to disobey your duty, and there are times when duty must be followed as iron law. Anakin has learned to tell the difference and sees this as a case of the latter. The two space bums face down Count Dooku, but he absolutely bodies them. Then Yoda shuffles in, and I can't relate to you how unintentionally comical this next scene was in the cinema. After everything we'd just gone through to cap it off with this, I felt weird and a bit guilty for laughing, but boy did that not stop me. Yoda loses the fight and Dooku gets away. The movie ends on a dark note. Anakin and Padme are being married. They have decided to disobey their duties. Because they taught each other that duty was not always necessary. They have started down a slippery slope. And at minute 130, the movie ends. Which, if you've been paying attention, gives a third act of 30 minutes or 23.1%, the same length as the first act. The first act is shorter than average, and the third act is longer than average. But another prominent movie to have the same spacing is Apocalypse Now. Given George's historical film knowledge and his involvement in his friend Francis's productions, I would argue that this is no coincidence. It seems that George decided Attack of the Clones was a war movie, and then decided to model the structure of it on his buddy's lauded effort in the same direction. It also leaves the film nicely symmetrical. It's like poetry, well, you know. The saddest thing about this misfire is that all the ingredients were there. An excellent cast, provocative ideas, a smart theme exploring the slippery slope from duty to disobedience, a protean pseudo-noir peppered with eye-popping set pieces, and with a bit of tweaking, it might have been a lot better. For example, I genuinely believe that making the clones all changelings and replacing Dooku with Qui-Gon would massively elevate this movie. As well, the brotherly bond between Obi-Wan and Anakin is sorely underexplored. To that end, I would have made Anakin the protagonist. Open on the usual star field, but have it warp and whirl and the stars begin to fall, forming a vision of Shmi in great suffering. Then cut to Anakin waking in distress. Foreground and foreshadow this more aggressively. Then you can follow the existing plot of the movie, but have Obi-Wan show more compassion about Anakin's mother. Maybe even have Obi-Wan give grudging permission for Anakin to go off-grid and check it out. Then, amidst the assassination/protection subplot, have Anakin decisively blast off for Tatooine in the honeymoon. The midpoint of this movie is the midpoint of the entire prequel trilogy. Like the cave scene in Empire, this one should hit really hard. So I would argue that Shmi essentially must die at the midpoint, not at 63% as she does in the finished movie. While we're at it, we can also flesh out the second half with a much greater sense of tragedy. Have Obi-Wan confront Qui-Gon in his detention cell, not Dooku. This can be the low point, as in the film. The following stretch of soul-searching should put Anakin and Obi-Wan in adjacent cells, able to talk to each other instead of this terrible set piece. Have them bond over their shared pain. Touch on the theme by having Obi-Wan admit to Anakin that despite Qui-Gon's evident turn to the dark side, Obi-Wan is not capable of following his duty and fighting him. Have Anakin promise that he will make sure that Obi-Wan will never have to fight Qui-Gon. This can be the break into Act 3. Anakin has accepted his duty to Obi-Wan and reiterates his resolve to be a better and more obedient Jedi. Then we need to streamline this third act, have it be more focused. The first half should focus on escaping the arena, that's fine, but then the second half should be laser focused on preventing Qui-Gon from getting away. Any shot without Anakin, Obi-Wan, or Qui-Gon in it should just be cut. Focus, George, you can do it. The reversal, the midpoint of Act 3, should have Mace Windu ordering Obi-Wan and Anakin to go and kill Qui-Gon. Obi-Wan is devastated and wants to refuse. Mace reiterates that this is an order and Jedi are duty-bound. Anakin nods to Obi-Wan and reluctantly, they go after Qui-Gon. Following a chase, Obi-Wan tries to talk Qui-Gon down. When this fails, Anakin goes in for the fight, just like in the finished movie. But then, just like in the finished movie, he is roundly beaten by his old savior. Maybe he hesitates just long enough because of the fact that Qui-Gon saved him from slavery. In any case, Anakin is defeated and Qui-Gon turns against Obi-Wan. Tragically, with tears flowing, Obi-Wan ignites his lightsaber. I mean, this thing writes itself at this point, and the movie ends the way it does in the finished version, except that Obi-Wan is at Anakin's wedding. Remember in Star Wars, when Obi-Wan says,
"And he was a good friend."
well, let's show that. Anakin did everything he could to prevent his friend from having to fight Qui-Gon. He just happened to fail. Now, obviously, this isn't what George chose to do. George put all his efforts into the technology of the movie, and none of his efforts into the bits of the movie that actually evoke emotion. Case in point, the main hour-long documentary on the DVD's bonus disc for this movie is purely about how ILM made a digital Yoda. Another case in point, much time and effort was spent developing digital video technology to save George the time and expense of having to scan every frame of film into computers for the CG work. Another case in point, all these fine actors are sleepwalking through their roles, and none of them seems to have a pulse. Yet another case in point, I can't tell you if this movie is about clones or changelings or politics or war, it's just a mess. George was more interested in advancing filmmaking technology than he was in making you feel something. And that's the real tragedy of this movie, and it's what makes it such poor equipment for living. Thanks for watching this breakdown. If you found it insightful, please leave a thumbs up. If my ramblings have stoked an insight in you, I'd love to read it in the comments. Bye for now.